Okay, let's see now what happens if I do this. Oh, good, I'm still there. Okay.
You're still there. All right. Well, welcome everybody. We're going to start as we do always with our blessings, and we're going to say Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher k'dishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. You sanctify us with commandments, and you command us to engage in learning of Torah. And this week's Torah reading is one of the least favorites of a bat or bar mitzvah student.
I'll bet.
It includes all sorts of questions of purity and impurity, circumcision, birth, and the topic that we're going to look at tonight, which is biblical diseases.
Do you think COVID could be classified as one?
No. It might. I would say that COVID counts as a disease of biblical proportions, but not one that's chronicled in the Bible.
Very good. Very good.
So this is Professor Leibowitz, Nehama Leibowitz, the Israeli professor who has done all these wonderful little pieces on, or not so little. This is a very long piece, actually. I don't think we'll get through it. And it covers a lot of stuff that starts in this week's Torah reading, but it covers a lot of different areas. So our Parashat tonight is Tazria. This is the fourth of her commentaries. And she is starting, this is Leviticus chapter 13, verse 2. And yeah, this is some of the, most skin crawly stuff, because it is, of course, skin disease. So we've got Adam ki yihyeh be'or b'saro se'et o safachat o becheret. So when a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, right? So any person really with on the skin of their flesh, a se'et, which is this swelling, a safachat, some sort of scab, or a veheret, literally a bright spot. V'haya ve'or b'saro, and it's on the skin of his flesh, lenega sara'at. So this is the word that we're going to be looking at tonight, sara'at. So this is the outbreak or the plague of sara'at. What did we do with them? Behuva el Aharon hakohen. He will be brought to the priest, to Aaron the high priest. O el echad mibanav hakohanim, or to one of the sons of the high priests. So there we go. This is this verse in chapter 13 in Leviticus, and here is what Professor Leibowitz has to say about it. Tazria-Metzora, the two parshiot which deal with the laws of uncleanness and cleanness, are particularly difficult to fathom. So she's saying that. So we're set up here for a little bit of a challenge. In order to avoid any misconception of unclean and clean, we must note that the Torah does not identify these with good and bad, or holy and sinful. This is very important. One of the challenges that we have whenever we read Torah is the way Torah comes into English, and the way English has historically treated certain concepts. This concept, that of cleanliness, has a whole host of English connotations. Number one, in the religious realm, cleanliness is close to godliness, right? Being clean is an identifiable virtue as opposed to something not virtuous. So there is already a value judgment, dare we say, a moral judgment about cleanliness and uncleanliness. Dirty is a word that also has moral connotations in contemporary English. So we are struggling here because we are trying to understand a culture that has a very different attitude. When we are talking about ritual cleanliness and ritual uncleanliness in the Torah, these are not judgments. One is not morally implicated or one's ritual impurity, because ritual impurity, ritual uncleanness is part of life. It is part of the cycle through which all of us go. Doing normal things like walking through a cemetery makes one ritually unclean. Why? Because touching dead stuff makes us ritually unclean. Why is it bad to touch dead stuff? No, we have to. We have to prepare a body for funerals, for interment. And that's a mitzvah to do that. So it's not a bad thing, it's a regulation thing. Think of one of the ways to think of ritual purity and impurity is a regulating of access to things that are sort of hot potatoes. You don't want to overexpose oneself to certain states. Those states include both birth and death, that we want to honor them. And so what ritual uncleanness, what ritual impurity means is that before one does it again, one needs to get clean. One needs to get purified so that one doesn't do it and disregard it. In other words, I'm not going to spend all my time touching dead bodies because there are other things I need to do that require me to be ritually pure. So I'm going to go through the ritual purification to go and do those other things. And then I'm also understanding that I need to be ritually pure to do certain things again. So for example, touching a Torah scroll makes one ritually impure. So there's this idea, and this idea comes in large part from a colleague of mine named Rabbi Sarah Lev. And she pointed out that ritual impurity tends to be imparted when we approach the holy moments that are closer to God. That getting close to holy items, to life and to death and all of these things makes us ritually impure. And that therefore it's a regulation of access to these things so that we respect them. But in any event, that gives us some context. We shall introduce our study with David Hoffman's comments ad hoc on the structure of this chapter, the order of the subjects, and their interconnection. So this is a commentary about a contemporary commentary. So here, Rabbi Hoffman says, animals transmit uncleanness only when dead. People, however, can become a source of uncleanness under certain circumstances, even when alive. The following chapters deal with the cases of uncleanness whose origin is the human body. Sara'at is the severest of this type of uncleanness. Consequently, this ought to head this chapter of uncleanness, but since the human being, on being born, causes our own mother to become unclean, it is the covenant of circumcision that commits a person, a man, to avoid uncleanness throughout their lifetime. The Torah considered it proper to begin with the uncleanness a person causes on entering into this world. Does carrying the Torah around the sanctuary count as making one impure? Depends who you ask, Bob. Most people would probably not consider it. They would only consider it having reading the Torah. But I think anybody with a reasonable degree of stringency who cares about ritual purity would probably want to go to the mikveh after Simchat Torah, before doing things that required ritual purity. So Rabbi Hoffman points out that because Sara'at, which we're going to be discussing, is the most serious type of impurity, of uncleanness, we ought to be talking about it first. but we don't. We talk about the impurity that happens when women give birth, and the impurity and the difference between giving birth to a boy child and a girl child, and the ritual of circumcision. And these take precedence because they are about the creation of people and the creation of our covenantal relationship, something that's meant to remind us to avoid ritual impurity throughout our lives. So that's Rabbi Hoffman's rationale for the order of this chapter. But that is just an aside. Professor Leibowitz takes us back, but what is this Tzara'at in its different forms, which is the subject of the two Parshiot, of the two Torah readings? Let us begin with Maimonides' explanation in Hilchot Tumat Tzara'at. So for those of you who've been learning Maimonides with me, this is Maimonides' legal code, and this is his code of rules about ritual impurity, which is Tumat of Tzara'at, the ritual impurity of Tzara'at. And again, we're not translating Tzara'at here because the translation into it as leprosy is a mistake. It is not talking about leprosy. That is a misnomer. It doesn't fit any of the categories of leprosy. It's not leprosy. Just in case anybody asks.
Okay, so if the act of giving birth makes the mother unclean. Okay, did she just stay that way until she goes to the mikvah?
It means no more sex after birth until you get ritually purified. So one needs to be in a state of ritual purity in order to have sex, and having sex places one in a state of ritual impurity. It is a way of placing a fence around the sex act that says it's important enough to get clean for. Don't treat it with disrespect.
No.
Yeah. So, and of course, having birth is a big deal.
Especially for the person being born.
Especially for the person giving birth, too. Tzara'at is a collective term which comprises several unlike symptoms, like a white patch on the human skin, the loss of some head or facial hair, and a change in the appearance of garments or in the walls of a house. That's right, houses and clothing get Tzara'at. So this is not leprosy. Houses don't get leprosy. So Professor Leibowitz responds to Maimonides, are these just natural diseases, decay or mold that turn the Torah into a medical handbook for the use of a public health authority? Or do they constitute something supernatural, the Creator's wondrous work to serve as a warning and to cause God's followers to mend their ways? So this is a reasonable question. The handbook here goes on and on and on about how to treat this if one's a priest. Right, the priest is involved in the treatment of Tzara'at. But is the priest some ancient doctor, or is there something else going on here? Are we dealing with something that has a moral message? Or is it merely, hygiene? The differing views of our sages and commentators span both extremes. Oddly enough, an opponent of the hygienic dietetic interpretation of the dietary laws, like Abravanel, who in rejecting Maimonides' view states, far be it from us to consider the Torah as a medical manual, explains the Tzara'at of garments and houses in rational, practical terms. So here's Abravanel. So Abravanel is, I believe, lives in the 1400s. So he's reading Maimonides, and he is an opponent of the hygienic dietetic interpretation of the dietary laws. So he doesn't interpret keeping kosher in health terms, and says and rejects Maimonides' idea that there's anything health-related having to do with keeping kosher, with this quote, "Far be it from us to consider the Torah as a medical manual." Nonetheless, here is a Brabanel. What does he say? Some objects made of weaker material and used by people to clothe their body may be affected by their experiences. Silk and metal objects, being strong materials, would not be affected by their owner's use, as would wool linen worn constantly on the body, like a tunic or leather shoes. Since the person suffering from tzara'at may affect these items while in their seclusion, and their disease and the decay of parts of their body may produce stains on their clothing, just as a heavily perspiring patient's sweat frequently dyes their garments, the Torah feared that they might wish to use them after recovering from their disease and suffer a relapse. So the garment picks up tzara'at from the person and might retransmit it to the person. So this seems like a pretty medical definition.
Yeah.
So Ralbag, who is Garsonides, similarly offers a rational explanation for tzara'at of garments and houses. So this is another later scholar says that tzara'at on these garments and houses is caused by the prevalence of the alien moisture and heat over their natural heat, and this would fray and damage them. The discoloring is like the one that can be observed in stagnant waters where the decay turns them red or green. That's right. Here is a religious commentator basically treating this like a book you pick up at Home Depot. You got mold. But remember, it's got the same name as the skin disease. Several earlier and later scholars consider quarantine of the Metzora, a Metzora is somebody who's suffering from tzara'at, outside the camp as a preventative measure against the spreading of an ostensibly contagious disease. Seems like something we're all familiar with at this point.
I'd say so. Yeah.
The Meshech Chochmah's comment combines rational and irrational elements. So this other commentator says, they shall be brought to the priest. The preoccupation with these plagues entrusted to the judgment of Aaron and his sons is one of the mysteries of the Torah. If the priest, the Kohen, who decides whether the patient, it is the priest who decides whether the patient is clean or unclean. So that's weird, right? We don't really have the priest fulfilling another role, sort of health monitor, public health official, but here they are, deciding whether or not a patient is, infected or uninfected, clean or unclean. However, it may be that we are dealing with an infectious disease, and treating it may be fraught with danger. The doctor, therefore, needs special divine protection to be immune to it. That is why the Torah assigned the task to the sons of Aaron, who have a special status and enjoy particular divine protection. That's right. The Kohens, the high priests, are immunized. They are pre-vaccinated against tzara'at because of their closeness to God. So it is both an infectious disease and something that one's elevated holy status protects one from. And if you're saying, we're in it together, right? But just as an aside here, there is no agreement at this point among our scholars through the ages as to what this thing is. Isn't that weird? Isn't it strange that here is, it shouldn't be strange at this point if we've been learning together for a while. Because it turns out that, generally speaking, Jews don't agree about these things, right? We find something in the Torah, we listen to it, we study it, and Rabbi Yosef says it's this, Gersonides says it's that, Rashi says it's something else, and Maimonides says you're all wrong. Or Nachmanides says you're all wrong. I mean, they're all arguing with each other through the ages. Something that I've said a number of times in the past is that Ginny said when I moved from being a philosophy major to a rabbinical student, that I just moved the group of dead people I was arguing with. That I moved from, dead Chinese, Japanese, and European scholars to dead Jewish scholars. It was just a different subgroup. All right. However, if the plague denotes a natural phenomenon requiring isolation as a preventative measure against contagion, the question arises, why has the Torah selected this disease and has not alerted us to the countless natural risks that surround us in our daily life, like poisonous plants, wild beasts, and dangerous illnesses, but left their discoveries to human intellect, judgment, and research so that we may become partner to God's creation? Why this thing? There's so much else that the Torah could be talking about. Yes, Adina, thank you. I like what Ginny says too. She's way smarter than I am. And wait till you start talking to our kids. They're smarter than both of us. So this is a really important question. How is it that the Torah seems to leave everything else up to us, right? There's no medical manual in the Torah. There's no listing of poisonous plants. There's no, wait an hour before you go swimming after lunch in the Torah. But here, there's an elaborate thing around this tzara'at. So this tends to push us, one would imagine, towards the idea that there's something symbolic, something moral, something else going on here. Because the Torah does not systematically approach health issues. So here, Professor Leibowitz continues, our sages have said the works of creation must be complemented by people. That is, they must be cultivated, perfected, and adapted to human needs. This includes the unceasing war against all kinds of natural risks and dangers, from the manufacture of clothing to the building of houses, improving and increasing food supplies, and medical research. Most of our commentators see the complementation demanded of people alluded to in the blessing, which also implies a commandment given to Adam in Genesis 1:28. Umilu et haaretz v'kivshuha, and fill the earth and subdue it, right? So this is often our idea that we have some mission. It's often used as a justification for doing whatever we want to the earth, but really it's about this partnership. How does Nachmanides explain this? Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides. Nachmanides lives after Maimonides in Spain in the 1200s. And he says on this verse, and subdue it. God gave them, people, the power to do as they see fit to the animals and all living creatures, to build and to uproot and to hew copper from the mountain and the like. God gave us leave to do it, right? We've got that power. But the Torah does not state the ways of developing farming, of digging tunnels or building bridges, or how to transform arid land into fertile soil. For all this is the task of people, not the concern of the Torah. People have been endowed with the ability to think and to invent, to invest and discover the secrets of nature, and shall cause them to be thoroughly cured, it says in Exodus. So this is important. Unlike some people who read scripture so literally that it confines the way they interact with non-scriptural thought, right? So Seventh-day Adventists who refuse to accept blood transfusions because it says in the Torah, you shouldn't consume blood. It doesn't say in the Torah, don't use the methods of contemporary medical practices to save your life. Rather, it says life is really important and we ought to put life first most of the time anyway. They didn't have blood transfusions in the time of the Torah. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't have mRNA vaccines. So just because it's not in the Torah, does that mean it's prohibited? Jews have always said the opposite. If it's not in the Torah, we have to figure out, is it upholding a principle from the Torah? Is it expanding our understanding of life, the universe, and everything and making things better? Or is it damaging? And we're supposed to use our reason to come up with that. The Torah is not an encyclopedic blueprint for everything we encounter. It's a list of principles by which we're supposed to develop character that allows us to encounter the world better. This verse in Exodus is explained in the Talmud in Bava Kama as follows. It says, in the academy of Rabbi Yishmael, it was taught, hang shall cause him to be thoroughly cured. Hence, we know that a physician is allowed to cure. And Rashi says, and we do not say, God has smitten, God will cure, right? We don't say that. We don't leave it up to God. We leave it up to us. Maimonides further goes on, quoting this dictum of our sages in his work Torah Ha'adam, the Torah of people. Hence, we know that a physician is allowed to cure. That is, the Torah has given permission to cure so that the physician should not refrain from attempting to cure for fear of erring and be guilty of manslaughter. And look at how practical we are. We give permission to doctors to work for cures because we say we're not going to prosecute the doctor for losing the person's life as if they were participatory in their death. You can see Jews, our ancient sages, are already anticipating the questions about malpractice. So, but it is not the concern of the Torah to give instructions in the art of healing or in the science of curative treatment. It is up to people to investigate and research the origins of diseases and to discover their cures. Rabbi David Hoffman adduces in his work on Vayikra several arguments refuting the idea that the laws of the Metzora, of the sufferer of Tzara'at, are measures of sanitary policing. The very details of those rules prove that not prophylaxis is their purpose. They're not preventative. They're not protecting people. For does not the Torah order to clear the house of all its contents before the priest's arrival in order to avoid their becoming unclean upon the Kohen's positive pronouncement? So, right, if they're meant to prevent things, then why clear the stuff that might be contaminated before the priest gets there? If the priest is going to get there and judge the house contaminated, why would you clear all the stuff that might be contaminated from the house? All right, Steve asks, this is off topic, but can you talk about the idea of cleanliness or perfection as it relates to sacrifices? Animals can't have blemishes. For Sukkot, the etrog has to be perfect. I think there is also something about blindness. And if there's any correlation to what we are talking about. These are different categories, Steve. You're mixing human ritual purity with purity for the sake of an offering. The purity for the sake of an offering is the quality of the offering. It has nothing to do with ritual purity in cleanliness and uncleanliness that we're talking about here with regard to disease or other things. Different category entirely. The Talmud goes at great length into what to do with an animal that is ritually suitable, which is a better word for it, for one offering, but is lost and then found, and no one can be sure what offering it's for, and so it's deliberately downgraded so it can be sold, because you can't sell something that was originally designated as sacred if it's suitable. So you allow it to live until it acquires a blemish, and then you sell it, and then you give the money to the temple. So totally different system. And blindness, are we talking about blindness in people or blindness in creatures? Again, blindness in creatures is whether or not a creature is suitable for an offering. Blindness in people, deafness in people, totally different thing. That has to do with whether or not in the ancient priesthood system, there were all sorts of what we would now identify as discriminatory requirements for the physical perfection of somebody who is sanctified as a priest. Again, different system. We've got a lot of different systems. This system is primarily dealing with cleanliness and uncleanliness with regard to the ritual cleanliness and uncleanliness of what one is suited to do in the course of normal life. And that's why the illness question here is a big one, because if it's a real illness, are we talking about, as Rabbi David Hoffman says, sanitary policing? But if we're not talking about sanitary policing, if it's not really contagious, right? Again, because we're talking about the people clear the stuff out of the house without any designation as to whether or not it itself is contagious before the priest comes in to decide whether or not the house is contagious. So this is not sanitary. It's not even getting rid of, the heebie-jeebies, right? So if contagion were to be prevented, Professor Leibowitz continued, then the opposite procedure would be required, right? If you think it's spreading, then you don't take the stuff that's in the house that might have it and move it out. That would be bad. That would be like, all right, everybody, we're worried somebody in the house is sick. Everybody go shopping now. Who are the "they're becoming unclean" preferred pronouns? Oh, Bob, I'm just doing a gender neutralizing of everything, because it's not only men who become unclean, but Professor Leibowitz wrote in a much more gendered Hebrew fashion, as did her translators. So I have a habit of correcting the English into a less gendered format. Anybody can become unclean. So according to oral tradition, which is the Talmud, as Rabbi Hoffman points out, the diseases mentioned in the Torah are to be disregarded during the time of the pilgrimage festivals in Jerusalem, and the priest is not to be called upon to investigate. Well, wait a second. It's a holiday. The priest is busy. Don't worry about the diseases. They're not health conditions if the priest's duties in Jerusalem call the priest away from needing to take care of the ritual impurity of the mold growing in your house, right? It can't be that serious. Had there existed here any intention of safeguarding public health, these quarantine regulations should have been enforced even more strictly with regard to the pilgrims when masses of people thronged the streets to Jerusalem, right? If you're worried about spreading it, don't send everybody to the baseball stadium together. So therefore, Professor Leibowitz brings us back to our original question. Wherein lies the difference between this and other diseases? Why does the Torah give detailed instructions for tzara'at? The view of those who see this as a supernatural phenomenon is therefore more acceptable, right? It's more likely to see this as connected to something coming from God that we don't understand than it is to seeing it as an actual health condition. Maimonides, in his commentary on the Mishnah, Negaim, which is all about these growths, says, our sages have said that tzara'at comes as punishment for the evil tongue. Right, so this is for slander and for gossip. And this comes from the Torah, where Miriam gets stricken by Tzara'at for saying bad things about Moses and his wife, and doesn't have it taken away until she apologizes. So this is a story in the book of Numbers. Our sage, so it's punishment for the evil tongue, for its owner is isolated and can no longer harm people with their loose talk. That's right. The isolation is not about contagion, it's about shutting a person up. This person is saying bad stuff, put them aside outside of the camp, and they can't spread their calumny. This will begin in their house. If they do not repent, the tzara'at will affect their bed and couches, as stated in the Torah, or in anything made of skin. If they do not mend their ways, their garments will suffer, and if this is not brought about their penitence, it will come on his body and the skin of their flesh. So therefore, we've got it. This is a moral disease. It is a calamity that strikes people who gossip. And if they don't stop, it gets worse. All I can say is the entirety of contemporary culture would be struck down. Right? The 24-hour news networks would be done for. So this is this is the continuation of Maimonides. Tzara'at was meant as a warning and chastisement, for we are obviously not dealing here with natural illnesses, since garments and houses are inanimate. This is rather a wondrous supernatural phenomenon, like the water which the sota, the suspected wife, is given to drink, and whatever happens to the garments and houses is like the plague affecting the human being, called tzara'at figuratively, and the tzara'at becomes clean when its color turns white again. And this is the most important message and purpose because of the spiritual nature of the entire subject of tzara'at. Maimonides dismisses the whole thing, says this doesn't behave like illness at all, it is entirely supernatural. Yes, so garments get the illness first and then transferred to the person, Bob says, then don't wear the garments, right? It doesn't help. Remember, it's a God-directed disease. There's no preventing it. The only way to prevent it is to stop talking bad language. All right, Maimonides uses the same approach, saying, and the garment in which there is a plague, the plague of tzara'at, this is something quite unnatural, as is also the plague of the house. But when Israel cleaves to God, God's spirit will constantly protect them and maintain the good appearance of their bodies, garments, and houses. But if any member of the people should sin, it will appear as a blemish on their flesh, garment, or house, which will show that God has departed from them. This is meant by, and I put the plague of tzara'at in a house of the land of your possession, for God is chastising that house. That's right, God punishes the house. The law of tzara'at is enforced only in the promised land, as it is stated, and when you come into the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession, though this is not one of the laws which depend on the land, it is nevertheless enforced only in the land which God chose for the presence of God's Shekhinah. So here, this is a reference to something very important. In the Torah, in rabbinic interpretation of Torah law, all of the agricultural laws, all of the laws having to do with tithing and all of this stuff are only applicable to Jews owning land in the land of Israel, tending land in the land of Israel when Jews rule Israel. So, and even though tzara'at is not dependent on the land, because it says, and when you come into the land of Canaan, it only occurs. You only have tzara'at of the house and the garment and the person when you're in the land of Israel. This, by the way, is a very useful rabbinic dodge because they have no experience of this disease. It's a mysterious supernatural disease that only appears in scripture, and the rabbis can't explain it, and therefore it only occurs under certain circumstances which are no longer around. It's a very good explanation. There's a footnote here on Maimonides, by the way, which I didn't go to right away, which is worth at least taking a glance at. Professor Leibowitz explains, it's not clear to me whether Maimonides' statement in the Guide for the Perplexed represents a change of attitude. So here's another statement of Maimonides. The uncleanness through Tzara'at we have already explained. Our sages have also clearly stated the meaning thereof. All agree that Tzara'at is a punishment for the evil tongue. The disease begins in the walls of the houses. If the sinner repents, the object is obtained. If they remain in their disobedience, the disease affects their bed and house furniture. If they still continue to sin, it attacks their own garments, then their body. This is a miracle received in our tradition, in our nation by tradition, in the same manner as the effect of the trial of a wife suspected of faithlessness, which is the sotah. The good effect of this belief is evident. Tzara'at is, besides a contagious disease, people almost naturally abhor it and keep away from it. Now here is where it seems like he may have changed his mind. He's having his supernatural disease and suffering from biology as well. And so here, Professor Leibowitz says, it's not clear to me whether this statement represents a change in attitude. I say, my proposal on this is Maimonides writes the guide for multiple audiences. And we've talked about this when we reflected on the guide for the perplexed and other sessions. One audience are the Jews who are looking to make sure he's not saying anything too radical. And for them, he throws in the classic interpretation here. And the other audience is the bunch of philosophers, both Jewish and Arab and Muslim and Christian, that cosmopolitan group of philosophers hanging out in Egypt at the time. And for them, I think he throws in the idea that it's actually a disease. I think Maimonides is writing for multiple audiences. But that's my theory. So is this the continuation? This may in fact be the continuation of Nachmanides. No, this is back to Professor Leibowitz. She continues, Torah Kohanim teaches that Tzara'at of the houses only came into force after the conquest and distribution of the land, when every person knew their possession, for then they are settled and fully able to acknowledge God's works and wonders, and the Shekhinah is ready to dwell among them. Okay, well, this actually makes sense. This is kind of a rational take on a supernatural appearance, right? You can't have houses get infected unless everybody agrees whose house is whose, and you're settled in the land and you have stuff. So when we are wandering people, we only have tents and our stuff is distributed on the camels and donkeys and backpacks, it's not so clear. But if you're settled in a place, then your house can actually be an indicator of one's moral state, as it were. Furthermore, Nachmanides continues this, and I think that Tzara'at of garments is also to occur only in Eretz Yisrael. So again, it's only a land of Israel thing. Furthermore, the Tzara'at laws refer only to white garments, since any blemish or stain on a colored garment might have been produced by the dye and would not be a divine sign. Only the wondrously wrought discoloring is a sign of uncleanness. That's right. If you've got a moral problem, it's only going to show up when you're wearing white. It's an earlier version of no wearing white after Labor Day. And finally, the repetitions in all but one verse in chapter 13 of garment, warp, woof, skin are a straightforward allusion to the fact that we are dealing with a supernatural phenomenon. So Nachmanides makes a big case that this is not a real disease, it's something supernatural. Sforno, who's a later commentator, considers only the tzara'at of garments and houses as supernatural. The human tzara'at is, in his view, a particular disease which comes as a sign of punishment, whose purpose is to cause the sinner to mend their ways. We quote his words regarding garments and houses. And the garment in which is the plague of tzara'at, this is without a doubt something supernatural, for only a faulty, deliberate, or accidental dyeing process can cause discolorment, whereas this law refers only to undyed white garments. So he's taking the Maimonides position and he's saying, okay, this is definitely supernatural. The Torah states that this unnatural phenomenon may occur on garments and in houses in order to make their owners aware of their sins. As the sages have stated in regard to the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, see how far-reaching are the consequences of the disregard of the Shemitah laws. A man does business with Shemitah produce. In the end, he is forced to sell his chattel. If he does not realize his error, he will eventually have to sell his land. Right? So there's a good fortune, bad fortune outcome if one doesn't do the appropriate tithing with regard to the Shemitah year. Right? So if you do business with the Shemitah produce, which is not supposed to be used for business, things are going to turn out badly for you. So Sforno is comparing that to the garments which are turning out badly for supernatural reasons, right? And all of this is because of God's compassion for those who abide by God's laws, right? God's compassionate and merciful if you abide by God's laws. If you don't, life is harder. The conclusion arrived at is that we are not dealing with a natural phenomenon caused by moisture, mold, or decay, but with manifestation of divine grace for those who have not yet reached the sublime attachment to God. They are reminded by God in wondrous ways, by warning signs appearing on their garments to mend their ways. And if this does not achieve its object, signs will appear on the walls of their houses. And Sforno concluded, since the generations have never attained to a level worthy of this divine grace, there is no record of any house ever been smitten by tzara'at. This prompted our sages to declare, there has never been, nor will there ever be, a house smitten with tzara'at. Okay, so here's the deal. Since this is meant to be an indicator for people who behave well, that their houses are not getting smitten, we've never had enough people behaving well to send this sign. We all are screwing up enough that even the well-behaved among us haven't reached a level whereby their house too wouldn't be smitten. And since it's meant to distinguish between the good behaving and the bad behaving people, and there aren't good behaving people behaving well enough to not be smitten, then there's no use for this. Yes, it's another lovely dodge for why this supernatural thing is not happening now. I mean, remember, what we're dealing with here is a mostly rational group of people, right? Our sages are not zealots. The rabbis of the Talmud understand that things work in a certain way. Maimonides is a scientist. Maimonides is a rationalist in a very rational time period during the Golden Age in Spain. All of these commentators are heirs to reason. And there is nothing reasonable about this. It doesn't fit in with anything in the Torah. Again, the Torah doesn't talk about disease. So why is this here? And they were all struggling to figure it out. And I hope for all of us, it helps us see that we're in this together with our sages. That sometimes the Torah throws us a curveball and it's a puzzle for them too. It's not like studying Torah is meant to be, provide us with certitude, with assurances. It's meant to provide us with a discussion where we end up with hopefully some slightly better understanding or teaching about the world than we had before. Sometimes, however, it's just weird, and this is the case. Sforno's comment on garment and house tzara'at may be applied also to that on the human body. When there is evident harmony between the Creator and God's people, they receive a warning sign which will stir them to make every endeavor and use all their moral strength to mend their ways. Martin Buber has very aptly interpreted the meaning of the tzara'at that afflicted King Uzziah in Chronicles for having taken the liberty of performing the holy service in the temple. This was the prerogative of the heathen kings in their temples. The kings of Judea enjoyed no such privilege, which belonged only to the priests. So here's the quote on that. According to this conception of Torah, tzara'at is an impurity which afflicts the body, the affected body or object. The impurity implies the marring of the relationship between God and man. When people and God aren't getting along, we have an outward manifestation of it. And so Martin Buber, who focuses on relationships, is saying, don't mess with the relationship with God, because if we do, it's going to have a physical manifestation on our bodies. We do not even need proof adduced by commentators and investigators, says Nehama Leibowitz, for we find this expressly stated in the prophet Natan's words to David when he was assured of the kingship for himself and his descendants. I will be his father, and he will be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with such plagues as befall the sons of Adam. The special role of the plagues as a warning sign against sinful behavior is understood by the 7-day interval, which is to elapse between the priest's examination of this person suffering from tzara'at. So this is back to our text. It's a warning sign because we've got a 7-day interval, because you've got to wait until you see if you've recovered from your moral imperfections, right? So this is tzara'at on the human body. So this is from this text. This is actually from Leviticus. Bin gei adam v'ra'ah hakohen et hanega. So with regard to the plague of a person, the priest will look on the plague. V'hiskir hakohen et hanega shiva yamim, and the priest will shut up the plague for 7 days. V'ra'ahu hakohen bayom hashi'i, and the priest will look on him on the 7th day. With regard to the tzara'at of garments, v'ra'ah hakohen et hanega v'hiskir et hanega shivat yamim v'ra'ah et hanega bayom hashi'i, and the same thing, right? The priest will look at the plague and shut up that which has the plague for 7 days, and then look at the plague on the 7th day. And same for houses, right? And then the priest shall command that they take away the stones in which the plague is. And if the plague comes back and breaks out in the house after the priest has taken away the stones, then the priest shall come and look and behold. And he shall break down the house, the stones of it and the timber and all the mortar of the house. Basing themselves on the gradual procedure, on the intervals between the priest's examinations and the progressive measures taken by the priest, our sages in the Midrash state, God the merciful never starts by punishing a person directly. We learn this from Job, as it is stated, and there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the asses were feeding beside them, and men of Sheva fell upon them and took them away and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and only I escaped alone to tell you. While that servant was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the fire of God has fallen from heaven and has burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and only I escaped alone to tell you. And while that one was yet speaking, there came yet also another and said, the Kasdim formed 3 bands and fell upon the camels and have carried them away and have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and only I escaped alone to tell you. While that one was yet speaking, there came also another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their elders' brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from across the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and only I escaped to tell you. So our sages in the Midrash are saying the whole point of this is that the afflictions are progressive, that God doesn't hurt us directly to correct us to start. God hurts us by hurting our stuff, or in Job's case, his family beforehand. And so the Midrash continues, it is likewise with Sara'at. It is likewise with this plague thing. If it achieves its object, nothing further happens. If not, the stones will be removed. If the owner does not yet repent, the house will be broken down. And if this has not had the desired effect, it will be burnt. Afterwards, the Tzara'at will come upon the sitter's body. If they repent, the object is attained. If not, they leave their home for temporary isolation. If they continue to sin, they shall dwell alone. Outside the camp will their habitation be. So this is a very interesting lesson. The lesson is, I mean, in one sense, we have the sages here saying, when bad things happen, take notice. Now, and again, they're focused on the connection between behavior and outcomes here. That somehow or another, what we're dealing with is a mysterious disease that is associated with our behavior. And I think they are teaching it to a certain extent as a rarity, as something that only happens because they know this is not the way reality works. That in truth, I misbehave and my house may be fine. In fact, I may be a terrible person and I may be rewarded. That the world does not follow in accord with reward and punishment for good behavior. That the outcome of the book of Job is that Job did nothing wrong. So we struggle with this text on so many levels. We struggle with it because, number one, it doesn't accord with anything we see in reality. There is no disease that behaves this way. Number two, if there were a disease that behaved this way and we needed a moral judgment, not a medical judgment to get rid of it, it would follow in this pattern of getting worse the less we repent, which is true. God only knows. If we're told to improve and we don't improve, things tend to get worse for us. So there is something of a moral lesson there. Because of course the rabbis want to keep on teaching in a moral way, even in a concept that is totally inscrutable. And I like this parsha because it challenges us with what is, for all intents and purposes, a profoundly flawed text. There is nothing from this explicit text that transfers directly to our lives. There's no one-to-one here. There's no, I know this person who, spread rumors and they got sick. And then they stopped doing it and they got better. Not only that, I know somebody who behaved badly and first their house got sick and then their clothing got sick and then they got sick and then finally they repented and it all got better. We don't have any of that. So here, and yet we still come back to it. So we've got a text that for all intents and purposes cannot speak to us. And yet we come back once a year and we read it and we say, it didn't speak to me last year. It's probably not going to speak to me this year. Is there something that I can do with it? Is there some lesson I can get from it? And sometimes it's just actually the talking through of something that doesn't speak to us that is helpful. There are things that we're not going to get. And we keep them in the family. There are people that we're not going to get. And sometimes we still have to talk with them. And the Torah is filled with parts, Steve had to leave early and it's funny that he's not here, some of which we like, some of which we don't like. And he's the first to point out, who picks and chooses and all of this stuff. And how can you say you're Jewish if you do some of it and not all of it and all this sort of stuff. Well, again, there's no way to do all of it. The question is, how do we make sense of some of it or most of it, and then figure out how to do better by it?
You know, as a child, my grandparents kept totally kosher. And I was always picking the wrong silverware to eat something with, in which case my grandmother would go out and bury it in the backyard. Now, you know, as a child, I was doing that. And it wasn't just one time, because obviously I did not learn or remember exactly where everything was.
Right. You didn't learn the system.
Yeah, and okay, first of all, I want to know, how does dirt take
So if
take
you,
the wrong stuff off the silverware?
because if you bury it for a year, anything that's wrong in it is determined to have deteriorated. It's the time period. It's not the cleansing of it. You still have to wash it when you bring it back in.
Well, yeah.
But the stuff on it is no longer contaminating if it's spent a year in the dirt. It's a little quicker to take it to the mikveh. You can actually wash your silverware that's come into contact with the wrong stuff. So your meat silverware that's come into contact with dairy. You can set it aside. You can take it to the mikveh. You can dip it in the mikveh and then bring it home. The mikveh will purify it.
Well, I am sure that when my
Or as the transcription here says, the Mexico will purify it.
I am sure that when my grandparents or whoever sold that house, the new buyers probably dug up a ton of silver in the backyard.
I don't know. If your grandmother lived through the Depression, I will bet that she went through that backyard to pick up all that silverware before they left.
I don't see how she could remember where it was all planted.
Oh, boobies have their ways. There's a map somewhere.
Uh-huh.
It's the silverware placement map in the backyard. All right, well, it is time to count the Omer, so we can do that. It's a little early for Adina and Barbara to do so, but we'll say the blessing. So it's Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat haomer. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with commandments and commands us to count the Omer. Tonight is, the way we say this is Hayom Shiva Asar Yom
17.
Shnei Shavuot Ushlosha Yamim Ba'omer. So tonight is 17 days,
17.
which is 2 weeks and 3 days of the Omer. And it is the third day in the third week. So it is the week, the day of Tiferet, which is balanced beauty, in the week of Tiferet, which is balanced beauty. So tonight and tomorrow, we're going to focus our attention on figuring out how to find balance within balance, if one wants. And with that, it's a pleasure seeing all of you. Thank you, Adina. It's good to have you here. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Eliyahu/Phil and Banjo Bob. I look forward to seeing you all soon, and may you have a great week.
Well,
Thank you, Rabbi. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.